Session switches to a different topic. The Draper Hills program has always been split in a way between people that are addressing two different kinds of political problems. So in completely closed political spaces, Zimbabwe or Egypt now or Russia, the main challenge has been to resist the authoritarian abuse of power. And so the focus there is on civil society, on people that want to open up a closed system to democratic participation. But there's another set of problems, which is what happens once that opening occurs. And there's a democratic breakthrough, there's an opportunity to create a more democratic political system and a more democratic society. And then the question shifts not from resisting the unjust use of power, but rather to the exercise of power in democratic ways. And that requires a completely different set of skills. And I would say, observing some of the setbacks to global democracy in the last few years, that the two are related to one another, that part of the reason that you've had the closing of democratic space is that people have basically messed up the transition, that they haven't taken advantage of the openings that they've had. That, this can apply to a lot of countries. I think the one that everybody would think first of is actually Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, where there was a demonstration of popular mobilization that got Viktor Yanukovych out of the presidency. But then the Orange Coalition proved that they really couldn't govern terribly well, and as a result, he was elected perfectly legitimately back into power a few years later. And so now the struggle after the Revolution of Dignity or the Maidan revolution is to try to do it again, but do it better. And so this is an issue that I think we all need to think about, even those that are still operating in closed spaces. Inshallah, one day you will be in a position where you can actually worry about the problem of how do I, get the electricity going, how do I turn the power on, how do I deliver education and roads and security to a democratically governed country. So that's really the topic. There are 3 people on the panel that have had experience in this, although I would note that in our group we have a number of other people that are on the government side of things. We have Olena, we have Miriam, one in parliament, one in the civil service. We have Salima, who is about to embark in this transition. So, we've asked a series of questions to all 3 of the panelists. First of all, what motivated the switch? In Lucila's case, it wasn't a switch. I mean, she comes from a political family, and so she was always located in politics. But those of you that made that transition from civil society into government, what motivated it? What did you learn having been in a position to exercise power? What advice do you have for people that are considering that switch? And then what are the particular experiences that are, unique to being in a position to, help shape the policies and institutions of your country? So, Andrei, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Frank. In August of 2014, Mustafa Najem, a fellow from Ukraine, asked Professor Fukuyama of his advice how Ukraine could avoid the mistakes of the Orange Revolution. And there are 2 footnotes to be taken about this. First, that Mustafa Najem is a Ukrainian journalist with Afghani background, which tells you something about the multicultural Ukrainian society. He was the man who started the Euromaidan revolution with his Facebook post. And then the second footnote is about the Orange Revolution. As Frank mentioned, it was a major, the things which happened after the revolution were major disappointment for the civil society. Huge expectations, a lot of reforms promised, and none of them delivered by the Yushchenko administration, and eventually it led to half-authoritarian regime of Yanukovych. So Frank's advice, or Frank's response, was very simple and very blunt. He told Mustafa and Ukrainians, you should go into politics. And he said, it's going to be a painful experience. Your hands will get dirty. You'll have to do a lot of compromises that politicians have to make all over the world. Your white gloves will never be white anymore, but this is the way to make profound changes and to make sure that those changes are irreversible. And at that moment, I perfectly understood what Frank was talking about, because at the time I already had 3 parliamentary terms of experience behind me. After the Orange Revolution, I transferred from television and civil society into politics, and quite often I felt lonely in the parliament and a lot of disappointments, but also we managed to do some brilliant things, including the law on access to public information, which we managed to pass even under the dark Yanukovych times. So Mustafa and many people from the civil society followed that advice. That's how he and several more wonderful people from the civil society joined politics after the Euromaidan revolution. And Olena Sotnik is one of the great representatives of these new faces in the Ukrainian politics. And basically, it's part of a major trend which we see in Ukraine. After the Euromaidan revolution, we see a lot of new faces coming from the civil society and from the private sector, from business, who are bringing their experience, their knowledge, their skills, and their principles into the government. And I think it's something new. It also tells us that the country has made some lessons from the mistakes of the Orange Revolution, and I think it's something which gives a lot of hope to us. To kick off this conversation, I'll just say 3 things from my experience, and they are very basic, but I think they're very important to survive. First, many of you remember this wonderful movie, From a Whisper to a Roar, based on Larry's book, and you should remember this metaphor about the dragon. And I think it's something you should remind yourself, that once you kill the dragon, you make sure that you don't become a new one. So it's not necessary to borrow bad, terrible habits from those people whom you defeated. And we are not just talking about big things, but also about small things, the way you organize your day, the way you run your team, the way you talk to people. A couple of weeks ago, I had a friend of mine from my journalist days visiting me in Ottawa, and he listened to my remarks at an event. And after the event, I came to him and asked, so how was it? And I hoped he would say something nice about my remarks. And he said, Andrei, it was terrible. I cannot recognize you. Where the Andrei I remember from your days in journalism and in the civil society, you have forgotten how to talk to the people. Don't you remember that you've got to find good stories to tell? You've got to appeal to stories that people can understand. So once we join the government, once we join the politics, let's not forget how we achieved this wonderful support of people when we worked in the civil society. Second lesson, it's you've got to find your way to get bureaucracy involved. And I think it's really important, and quite often we neglect this. And I'm very happy that yesterday Saïd Al-Ounesi from the Tunisian government mentioned this. When you come from the civil society, most likely the bureaucracy you're going to work with will not be happy about you. They still remember how you gave hard time to them. They're afraid the changes you're bringing might hurt them, or at least they are very skeptical about what you're going to do. And nevertheless, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to move forward with your wonderful initiatives if you don't get them on board. So you've got to find your way to get them on your team to be part of the changes that you're bringing. And one example which I would like to share from my ambassador's experience, one of the things which surprised me when I came as an ambassador, that the average planning cycle in embassies is just 1 year. Some ambassadors would like to plan something for their terms, but let's be honest about this. It's peanuts for countries when you think about 1 year or even 4 years. So we did 10-year planning, and the whole team was involved. And we rotated, we switched turns when someone was presented what group worked on. So the very final presentation was on our long strategic goals in terms of 10 years. And it happened to be the guard of the embassy who was presenting his group ideas for this 10-year strategy. And I was looking at that, I was watching him, I was listening to him, and I was like, wow, this is something which we really should cherish, when we can get all the members of the team being part of this strategy development and the planning. Finally, my last thing I'd like to mention right now, it's stick with your constituency, which is the civil society again. They need you, you will need them, you will badly need their support during your darkest days. And sometimes you might feel that not all your old friends from the civil society will be happy about what you do. They're going to criticize you a lot, but you badly need to keep this connection. Sometimes it's really crucial for the big things you're going to do. In the very early days of Euromaidan revolution, I happened to be one of the communicators between the political opposition and the civil society. And that helped us to bring together those two wings of the revolution, the political opposition and the civil non-partisan society. I know the only thing why I was in that role, because I had kept my connection with the civil society, and I hope I had some trust on both sides of the story to be those people who communicated. So I think those are very basic things which I try to remind myself, and optimism. Before coming here, I visited Dauphin, Manitoba. It's a tiny community in the prairies of Canada. That's where the Ukrainian immigration to Canada started from. And there are 3 monuments. There are 2 monuments in this tiny town. The first monument is called Optimism. It's at the railway station. When you arrive to a new place, you need optimism to start this new life. The second monument is called Perseverance. And it's about this dedication and hard work which you will need to get something done. And the mayor told me that next year he would build the third monument, and it's going to be called Faith. And I looked up the definition of faith, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the first definition that it gives, it's not about religion. It says, faith is allegiance to duty or a person. You should remind yourself that there was some major cause which brought you into politics. It's about this duty. If you feel it, you've got to find ways to deliver the results that are expected of you.
Okay, thank you, Andrei. Atishi, please.
So I think many of us in this room are activists, and activists have had this experience that when you go to politicians and you go to bureaucrats and then you present some policy propositions to them, you're often treated like dirt, that they don't really listen to you. If you're lucky, about 10% of your proposal will get accepted, and it's probably totally torn apart in spirit by the time it's actually implemented. And so this is an experience that I think all activists, civil society activists have had, and so have I individually. And so did we as a movement, because my own transition from civil society to politics was not an individual transition. It was the transition of an anti-corruption movement that happened in India, which started in 2011. And the couple of years before that had seen, India is famous for its corruption. Corruption is there at every level. When you're getting your driving license, there's corruption. When you have to pay your taxes, anyone who has to pay property tax, build a new house, right up to how coal mines are given away. So from the lowest level of government officials to the highest levels of governance, there's corruption. But in that particular phase, a lot of very large scandals, corruption scandals, came into the public domain. And there was something called the 2G spectrum scam when the 2G spectrum was allocated. And I remember the headlines of one of our leading dailies. It said 176,000,000 as the amount of money that had been lost to the public exchequer. And there was a lot of anger against this corruption, and an anti-corruption movement started. And it started while there was a group of civil society activists leading this movement against corruption, but the entire movement was very widespread. It sort of spontaneously spread to different parts of the country. And we would often hear days later that, oh, there was a protest in this city as well. And I think the government was clearly shaken. There was a demand that there should be a strong anti-corruption legislation passed. And governments, being governments, of course, did not want a strong anti-corruption legislation because the very people who were in power would be inside jail if that legislation was actually passed. But public pressure was very high, and you had thousands of people who got onto the streets. And of course, the governments managed to aggravate it further by arresting a lot of the leaders of the movement and getting more public onto the streets. I was sharing an incident this morning over breakfast with one of our colleagues here about how the government imposed something in the Indian Penal Code called Section 144, where more than 4 people gathering together is unlawful assembly. And Section 144 was imposed all over the country at the time of this anti-corruption movement. And there's this amazing incident from a small town in North India called Meerut, where there was this one doctor who said that, okay, more than 4 people is unlawful assembly. So Indian households often have these folding beds for visitors. So they pulled out a folding bed, put it in front of their house, and all 4 members of their household sat outside their door and said, we are 4, you can't arrest us. And then that entire street in that locality had 4 people sitting outside their homes. And so it was very clearly a spontaneous protest. But the government never passed the bill. The government never passed the legislation that we were asking for. The anti-corruption movement and this entire protest got, all kinds of abuses from the ruling class. The then sitting law minister of the country said about the anti-corruption movement leaders that they are third-raters and gutter snipes. Another senior leader who had been the chief minister of a very large state said, who are these people to tell us what law to pass? Who are sort of ordinary people on the street? We are parliamentarians. We get to decide. If they want to tell us what laws to pass, then they should come into politics and make laws themselves. And I think that entire movement, and I had been involved with civil society for many years, even before that. But I think that in civil society, our experience had always been that we were very small in number. And that's why we felt that we couldn't bring about a change. But in this anti-corruption movement, there were thousands of people on the streets of different cities. And yet, that pressure on governments could not be built. And that is the reason why the India Against Corruption movement transitioned into a political party. In November of 2012, a party was born. It was called the Aam Aadmi Party, which translates from Hindi as the party of the common man. And we decided to contest elections in a year from then, in December 2013. There were to be elections for the state government of Delhi, for the National Capital Territory of Delhi. So I don't know if many of you know, but Delhi is much larger in terms of population than many countries. Delhi has a population of 20 million. And so we decided to contest elections, and it was challenging. One of our colleagues here was talking about how it's difficult to raise funds for an anti-corruption NGO. Let me assure you that raising funds for an anti-corruption party is even more difficult, because the people who fund political parties have traditionally been those who want favors from governments thereafter. And raising funds was a massive challenge, and we went to everyone, friends, family, anyone whom we were connected through on social media. We even used to put out bed sheets on our rallies, and that bed sheet would go around, and we would ask people to put whatever little money they could to support the party. And I remember one of the moving things was that we couldn't, so for political advertisements, for hoardings, banners, a lot of money is required, and we didn't have any money. So a lot of our volunteers, they would, on these big crossings where you would have flyovers and there'd be heavy traffic, a lot of our volunteers would, in rush hour traffic, stand on those flyovers and hold the banners with their hands for hours so that we could have free advertising for people to see what we had done. And in December 2013, we contested our first elections. There are 70 seats in the Legislative Assembly in Delhi. And I think much to everyone's surprise, we won 28 out of the 70 seats in the assembly. But 28 seats, no party had a majority. And we formed a minority government for about a month and a half. And but I think that sort of scared the establishment. That scared the establishment that an anti-corruption force could potentially be a viable political force. Because any attempts before this in India for civil society activists who went into politics had never been a very viable alternative. I think people had contested elections but never really won. And we were in minority government for about a month and a half, and then we resigned and we called for fresh elections. Except the central government, would not have elections. They refused to have elections in Delhi, and they would just not announce elections. And Delhi went into president's rule, and you're supposed to extend president's rule every 6 months, and they extended it, and there was no signs of an election happening. And we ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and elections happened in Delhi once again in February 2015, exactly a year after, a little over a year after when the elections should have happened. And, but the interesting thing was that the delay caused by the central government actually benefited us, because we got another chance to mobilize on the ground. And this time we came back with a resounding majority. We won 67 out of the 70 seats in the Legislative Assembly, and we formed the government. Now, this is like a fairy tale story so far about the people who had no money, who came out of nowhere, and were fighting against corruption. But I think we believed that things would be easier once we went into the government. But I think that the past 2 years have shown how wrong we were. And I think that at least for us, I would say that things have actually gotten more difficult since we have come into government. I think that as far as politics was concerned, politics and government was the pitch or the sphere of all these vested interests, be it politicians, be it bureaucrats, be it big corporations, be it criminals. And the fact that people like us could be successful here really brought together all political parties and forces, because they didn't want us. And I think the amount of persecution that we have faced ever since we have come into government is probably unprecedented in Indian democracy. And the central government, by then the ruling party had changed in the central government, but they have used every agency they have against our government. The Central Bureau of Investigation is investigating multiple cases against our ministers. Delhi Police, because it's the national capital, comes under the central government. Over the past 2.5 years, on frivolous charges, at least 15 of our members of our Legislative Assembly have been arrested. The Enforcement Directorate is investigating the funds of our party. Income Tax Department has been doing raids against many of our donors. And the list just goes on, that every trick in the book is being used against us. And I know the fact that now we used to put up our, as an attempt in our transparency, and because we were coming from an anti-corruption background, we used to put up a list of all our donors on our website, which was not even required by the law. And we found that the central government was using our own efforts at transparency against us. And they started filing income tax cases against many of the people who had made donations to us. And people actually began to be scared of making donations to the Aam Aadmi Party. And so we have found that we have faced a substantial persecution in some ways. So that was number one, how agencies were used. Number two was an interesting experience that we had, that the Delhi government had something called the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and once we came into government, we started using it very intensively, and a lot of officers were suspended, a lot of investigations were initiated. And interestingly, the central government, under the pretext of the fact that police is not a state subject in Delhi, took away the Anti-Corruption Bureau of the Delhi government, which the Delhi government had for over 20 years. And they took it away literally by using paramilitary force. They sent paramilitary force to our Anti-Corruption Bureau and took it over and said the Anti-Corruption Bureau cannot come under the Delhi government. And so I think that really just went to show how scared the existing system was of, I mean, we're a small political party. Delhi is not even a full state. And you could see that how the various vested interests were coming together to prevent us from being successful in terms of our governance. So since anti-corruption as an agenda was gone, we took up various other citizens' issues as a part of our governance plan, be it electricity, providing water supply, education, health. And even in those, I think that in each of these fields as we started working, the vested interests that existed in any of these fields were incredible. Once we were not naive to think that there was no corruption, of course we knew there was corruption. But the extent of corruption that existed at every level of governance. So on the one hand, there was the high levels of corruption, and on the other hand, bureaucratic inertia. I think that inertia is the one adjective that really described the bureaucracy. And pushing the bureaucracy to actually implement the different policy agendas has been a real challenge. And a few days ago, someone had asked me that my title, I work with the government, my title is that I'm the advisor to the Deputy Chief Minister. So someone had asked me that, what do you do as the advisor to the Deputy Chief Minister? And they'd expected some sort of highfalutin response on policy making, blah, blah, blah. And I said, as in my role, I'm basically a file tracker. So government business happens on files. So I track whatever are our high priority policy agendas. Okay, it's in the finance department. So you call up the bureaucrat in the finance department. Then you make sure the file moves from finance to services, from services to education, from one level down to the other. And I think that when one goes into governance, the real challenge is not as much different kinds of policy. My own understanding after 2.5 years is that policy making is not rocket science. Often there are very common sense solutions that need to be put in place. But the real challenge lies in implementation and ensuring that you can actually take that policy and the money associated with that policy right down to the last mile. And that is one of the major challenges and learnings that we have had. One of the success stories that we have had is that we have found that in different policies, stakeholder participation and stakeholder accountability is something that has helped us make the bureaucracy work. And for example, in schools, in government schools, you have something called the school management committees, of which parents are supposed to be members. And the fact that how we have seen that a lot of these school management committees are supposed to have largely women members, or 50% women members. And how women who otherwise may not have ever stepped out of their homes, who are coming out of their homes for the first time, are actually beginning to get more confident in asking questions about why there are no teachers in the school, or why the school hasn't been cleaned, or why something hasn't been taught properly. And I think that is really what puts pressure on the bureaucracy and the government system to perform. I think the questions that we were asked, there was one question about what has been the most frustrating thing. And I could probably think of a list of 10 things that have been highly frustrating, and most of them revolve around bureaucrats. And, but yes, I think that eventually having, as I said, ensuring that policy making reaches the last mile, so evolving new structures for it, ensuring that there's systems of accountability, I think that has really been a learning. Has it been difficult? Yes, it has been difficult. I think that when you're a civil society activist, people look upon you as some kind of saint who has sacrificed so much, or you could have been earning so much money, and you're now living a simple life. But once you become a politician, everyone looks at you with some amount of suspicion. Everyone is totally and utterly convinced that you must be making some benefits out of all of this. That it couldn't be that you're entirely clean. You must have some money, some job, something or the other that is done. I think policy, being in government or being in politics is also it's very all-consuming. I think that as someone who has come from civil society and is in government, I think that there's so many times when you see things happening that you feel that now I'm in government, I should be able to do something about it. And yet when systems don't move, when people die because of lack of health care, when children are not able to get adequate education because government education systems have collapsed, I think that at times it's very frustrating to think that even though you're in the system, it's taking so long to sort it out. But I think that I'm convinced of the fact that this is the only thing that can make a difference. I think that to change a system, one has to wield power. However difficult that may be, however much your hands get dirty, I think that is the only option that we have. And despite, in the past couple of years, despite the kind of persecution that has happened of our party, despite the fact that one of our core anti-corruption agendas we have not been able to follow, I would still say that We have been able to provide better quality of education to 1.6 million children who study in state schools in Delhi. We have been able to provide improved healthcare. I was just looking at the figures that between January and March, more than 1 million people use some of the new primary health clinics that we have set up. And out of that, about 70% are women, because families don't like to spend on women's healthcare. There are far more people who today have toilets in their communities that they can use, and they don't have to go through the indignity of open defecation. So I think that while it's challenging, it at least politics, and through politics governance, gives one the opportunity to actually work in the interests of common people. Thank you.
Thank you. So what you say is, I couldn't have said it better, that the problem is really oftentimes not the policy, it's really the implementation. This has been my feeling for a long time, that we have these public policy schools that provide students with these very high-powered econometric techniques to determine what the best policy is, and then they get into government and they discover that that's completely useless because they can't figure out how to pull the levers of government in order to make even the simplest things happen. And so I think that's critical. Okay, Lucila, please.
Thank you. And thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share with you the experience we are having in Argentina. So I'm going to talk about the political reform in Argentina, which is connected with what we've seen and we've discussed yesterday, especially because Argentina returned to democracy in 1983 after a dark military government that ended with the Malvinas War. And it was very, very hard to reconstruct the institutions in Argentina after this government. So the point is, return to democracy, and then what? It's what we can expect after returning to elections. So nowadays in Argentina, let's say in O'Donnell's word, we are recovering a representative democracy after 12 years of delegative democracy. O'Donnell is a politologist. How do you say that word in English? It's one of our leaders in political science. And he described the delegative democracy as the concentration of the power in the executive power, or in the hands, or in the person of the president. Even they recognize popular elections or individual freedoms, but the thing is that they just concentrate the power. And I think that's what happened during the Cristina Kirchner period. So let me briefly introduce the history of the political history of Argentina, just to get in context of what we are going to discuss about political reform. Argentina got its independence from Spain in 1816, and recently, in 1854, we could have our first constitution, which was taken from the Philadelphia model. So we organized our country as a representative republic and a presidential democracy. But the thing is that during the 20th century, we had a first military coup in the 1930s. And that was one of the many military coups we had, and interrupt all the intents of democracy we had in our country. So, and one thing that it's important to know, to understand the actual situation in Argentina and the influence they still have, is the Peronismo. Perón was a leader that was military, and he was president in 1944. He was president for 10 years, and well, he was deposed by a coup, by a military coup, and he had to got asylum in Spain, and he returned to Argentina in 1973 as a president. But he died in 1974, and his wife was the vice president, and she continues his government, and then she was deposed too, because it was one of the worst democratic governments we had. So then we have this military government for almost 10 years, and as I said, we recovered democracy in 1983. So let me just start with political reform, which is important because when Alfonsín was the first president we have in democracy. He was the one who made the transition from the military government to democracy. And well, if we are going to talk about political reform, we have to agree that means the replace or modification of one or a combination of institutions. And what we had in Argentina right now is not a political reform. We had it in 1994 when we reformed the Constitution. So the purpose was, and today we were talking with Francis about the presidential system. The official purpose was to temper or moderate the power of the president and became more like a parliamentary system. But the real point of that reform was that Menem, that the president at that moment, wanted to be reelected. And because he wanted to be reelected, he had to make an agreement with Alfonsín. By that time in Argentina, we had the two-party system. So it was Peronismo or Partido Justicialista, which have all the doctrine of, of Perón, and the leader of Unión Cívica Radical, which is a very traditional party founded in the early of 20th century, which is very principle and Peronism is all different. So what happened was that Alfonsín wanted to have some seats in the parliament. So that's why they made this agreement. The consequence is that we change our constitution. Well, it's a little. I just pointed the things that I find that are important because we are still discussing these issues, and it's probably the heart of the democratic system in Argentina. So what happened that he reduced, the modification reduced the term of the president. It used to be 6 years, one term, so they reduced to 4 years, and the president could be re-elected. And after he finished, he could skip one period and then be re-elected again. So it's different from the USA. So also, the direct vote, we used to have the same system that here in the States, the electoral college. Now we have one circumscription and it's direct vote to select the president. Reduce the term of the senators. It used to be 9, now it's 6. And here is what Alfonsín requested. He wanted to add one more senator for each province. Because in this two-party system, what he wanted was the rule is 2 senators for the first party, and the third senator is for the second party in votes. So he imagined, Alfonsín, that in some provinces it would be 2 peronistas and 1 radical, or two radicales and 1 peronistas. And that way he could keep power in the Congress, in the decisions. So well, now, senators now are elected by vote, before appointed by the governors. No changes in the law and the House of Commons. This is very important because the chief of the ministerial cabinet is an institution created with this reform in order to temper the power of the president. But he is just a coordinate of the cabinet. Actually, the chief of cabinet is not even more powerful than a minister. I mean, he coordinates it. So it didn't work at all. They create a council with constitutional rank, the Council of the Magistracy, and it's related with the judiciary. It's the institution that organizes the contest for judges and also impeach them. And then the president selects the best judges and point them to the Senate to approve. this is for the federal judges, not for the Supreme Court judges. And also give constitutional rank to the General Auditing Office of the Nation, which is an external horizontal accountability system. And this is the secret of the discretion as in Argentina, or the power of the president. We give constitutional rank to the decrees on grounds of necessity and urgency. 5 minutes? Okay, I'm gonna. So, well, and the public ministry, it's composed by the attorney. I'm gonna point this because Macri is pushing this attorney, the chief of prosecutors. Well, what happened in Argentina then with the electoral reforms? We changed the organic law of political parties, which allowed to change the two-system party to a multi-system party. So we have a mess now in the Congress and also in the elections. Then we create the PASO system, which is like primaries. So in order to organize the elections, and it was supposed to have a few political parties with many candidates in running the elections. What we have is a lot of political parties with one candidate, so it's it didn't work. And Parla Sur is not an issue. What did Macri? He changes, when he assumed in 2015, he changes the organic law of ministers by decree. He just made it bigger, and now he's trying to reduce. He creates a Minister of Modernization in order to improve the public bureaucracy, and he tried to reform the electoral code to promote the electronic vote, but didn't pass the Senate yet. I'm gonna go first with this one. So why we see Macri's government different? Because he didn't make a political reform. Because he changes the way of do politics. And probably what I said before, he's returning the Argentina to a democratic system with a representative democratic and not delegative democratic. So he has a non-political style, he moderates his speech, he seems to reduce corruption, he desideologizes the institutions. During Peronista periods, you see bureaucracy and political parties almost the same. He normalized the economic institutions, and national and international, and this one is one of the most important things I would like to just focus, because it allows us to re-enter in the system, in the international system. And also open the market, reestablish a serious foreign policy, promotes infrastructure, promotes energy self-sufficiency, promotes the Argentine to enter in the Organization of Economic and Representative, promotes investment by creating special tools like public-private partner law, intends to agree with different labor unions. Those most are Peronistas, so it's very difficult, and intends to promote certainty, thing that I think it's very important in our country. Things to pay attention. He pointed to judges for the Supreme Court by decree, avoiding the procedure that demands a constitution. That was the first crisis, and you mentioned that today or yesterday. And he still uses decrees and necessity and urgent decrees as a regular tool to avoid the Congress, and it may have effects in the future, because he is modifying substantial law using these decrees. And, well, he failed in the electoral reform. Probably we can review this year this law. He pushes to fire the chief of the prosecutors using other mechanisms, but the impeachment, so careful with that. Inflation is not controlled at all, budget deficit is still high, and the high level of external foreign debt is high. Some reflections. Alternation, still the best way of control our democracy system and to avoid stillness in the structures. Economy seems to be one of the most important issues in citizens' life. Most of the society prefers moderate ideological positions. They feel more comfortable during the, well. Corruption doesn't seem to be an issue when voters choose the representative. Why? Because we had middle-term elections, we have primaries in August, and Cristina Kirchner, the former president, I close with this, was elected with, won the primary elections with 36% of the votes, and she's pointed as one of the most corrupted governments in Argentina. So we have to be careful with that. And well, just to finish, Argentina still has to work in institutions quality.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll open it up. You know, there's other people in the room that have been on the government side, you know, Vasil and Laura and so forth. So if you have any reflections, this is the time to make them. But Mariam, you want to start?
Yes, I can relate to a lot to what Artashi has said. I would point out to a phenomena which we have in Pakistan, where these people who have worked all their lives in the government and have been to the top-notch positions, when they retire, they form these NGOs. And they become a part of the civil society and the most ardent critics of the government. While they had not done anything to their account all their lives, but they come to the civil society after retirement, and this is what we have in Pakistan, and I think there might be some of these sorts in India as well. Well, policy making is, yes, good policy, which is very well worded, which is even based on evidence, seems to be an easy task. But when it comes to implementation, we are very quick to realize many impediments. These might relate to the political will, the resource allocation, many systemic or red tapeism hurdles, or even the inclusion, some issues like the reaching to the grassroots level, how to go to the grassroots level. But I feel that two issues which we don't count while making a policy is that you have to generate a kind of legitimacy and ownership for the policy while you're formulating it. And you can generate that only if and especially when the policy is of a national level, you can generate that while you include people, not just those who are sitting in various ministries and departments, they form an integral part of the process. But now the times have changed, you actually have to take the civil society on board. And I say this with personal experience. We have been making many security policies over past many years. We have remained in this really difficult security situation for over a decade. And this time, when we formulated a policy, we adopted a different process. We went to the people, we included the civil society amongst many of the stakeholders, and now they have taken the ownership and they have given a legitimacy to the policy, and it's not just the government who is implementing it, and they've gone down to the basic administrative level. So I think there's a realization when we faced an existentialist threat in the context of Pakistan that good policy making is not just a well-worded policy. It's not just even a policy based on data. It's a policy which comes from many stakeholders, and that can, to some extent, lead to its implementation. Thank you.
Okay. Laura. Stand up.
Do I have to stand up? No. I just wanted to make a comment because I think Atishi's answer to what she does should have been my answer when you asked me yesterday what I was doing. I'm an advisor to the Vice President and to the Minister of the Interior in Colombia, and that's basically what I do, what you just said. I just make sure everyone gets the right paper. I make phone calls. Sometimes I physically transfer, one paper from one office to the other to make sure that, policy making, formulation of policy, those grand words are not in my day-to-day task. But anyway, that's not the question I was going to ask you. One of the things I struggle with, and I think the whole government struggles with, is the right levels of participation for society. Why? Because in Colombia, the whole system was so closed that we started opening up instances for civil society's participation. And right now, there are so many that we reach the level of blockage. I mean, we cannot push any changes, in terms of formulation and policy making, we are struggling with paralysis because of the huge levels of participation that we have opened up. Of course, if I were to be, I wouldn't be saying this in Colombia because I would be quoted and it would be, I will have to respond to complaints by civil society, complaints by civil society, but this is a question I ask myself, what's the right level?
Okay. Katya.
Thank you. I'd like to challenge you. I think Alicia said that going into the government is the only way to make a change from inside. Andrei mentioned the role of civil society and how these are two elements of the government, for the government officials and the civil society to build the bridges between each other in order to make this change happen and make these policies implemented that our colleague from Argentina was mentioning. So I'd like to challenge you on that only way. Do you really see that, that everyone goes into politics and this should be a question, an answer to the question of the implementation of policies and producing good policies that will make reform happen? Or rather, you would see and agree that, and here I'd like to share my opinion, where I see that civil society and government officials, elected officials, have a common goal. They share a goal of bringing prosperity to the democratic societies. And the key of the implementation and of reaching this goal is actually dialogue between government officials and the civil society to find the common ground. So my question to you would be, where this common ground would be, and would your position be changed if you really see the benefits and actually build the dialogue around these issues and use the civil society to the best of the implementation of the government policies and allow civil society to advise you on these policies, on the quality of these policies? Thank you.
Okay. Yusmati.
First of all, I have to thank Andre, because in 2008, when I was selected for the program, and we have a special recording program on a Whisper to Aurora. In fact, I had the opportunity to move around the region, Asia, with Prince Hisham Mulail, Ben Moses, and the team. But what Andre said from the outset about the dragon, you know how the dragon, the new guy emerged, dragon come in many forms, and warrior come in many, what's it, is it many forms or many, something like that. So the question I want to ask, actually the extended version questions of Katya. Andre or Nitish from India, a friend from Argentina, what the extent of compromise, you know, the extent of compromise that politicians, civil society, in the name of common ground, in the name of collusion, in the name of national interest, sometimes they use that kind of word, that we have to agree upon. I put this in context. For example, now, we've been fighting for the reform for the last 18 or 20 years. But then now, a guy that we fought, the dragon that we fought last time, which is Mahathir, who ruled the country for the last 22 years, now joined us and lead the coalition. So, of course, someone tried to convince me there is such thing called political repentance. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced, Henry. I don't know, because please help me. Because I saw that in Prague, while I was talking, one young lady was said, please help my mother. And who's your mother? My mother is Julia. Julia now in prison. And Julia and Yushchenko was together. So when I see all this scenario, I really need your wisdom to share with me the extent of compromise that someone like us, if I can say us, to really, allow ourselves to compromise. Because I believe principle of compromise is needed in the name of bigger interest. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
After the 2008 elections in Zimbabwe, it was the disputed elections. After the mediation, there was a government of national unity. So we had opposition players and civil society leaders who were put into the government, but they become inaccessible, and their behavior was the same like the incumbent ruling party. So I would want to know your relationship with civil society and what you are doing to make sure that the voices of civil society are also found on the government agenda.
Okay. Why don't we cut it off there, and anybody on the panel don't try to answer all of the questions, but if there's any that are particularly relevant. Andre, you want to start?
Sure. Is it the only way? Yes and no. I'll start with no. Tonight we are going to have this reception at the EU ambassador's residence. And there are probably many ways to get there. You can take a bus, you can walk. Probably it's even better for your health and for your internal state of mind and harmony. But you might be late for most of the drinks that are there. If we're seeking for a successful, quick strategy, it's absolutely clear, it's absolutely obvious that in most of the situation, it's almost criminal not to use the experience, the capacity, and the principles that are available in the civil society, especially in the Ukrainian situation, where the civil society is so vibrant, is so powerful. So I'm a strong believer into this. And I see, moreover, it's not enough just to go, try, and leave. And this is another challenge which we have in Ukraine, when we have wonderful people who tried to do something in the parliament or in the government, and now they quit because it's tough, it's difficult, you don't get enough money. It's something we discussed in Seoul, I remember, during the Democracy Movement Forum, that if you don't get enough money just to support your family, you're not going to stay in politics or in government for a long time, or you just become corrupt. So it's not enough just to come and try. For Ukraine, we need at least 100 people who can devote 10 years of their lives to politics and government. Not just come and try, but stay there. We need this kind of dedication, and then I think it's going to help our country a lot. And something on the dragon. There is a wonderful Belarusian writer, Svetlana Alexievich, who became a Nobel Prize winner 2 years ago. And there is a wonderful quote from her. She said, it's not enough it was easier to win over the dragon than to deal with mice and rats. And that's another challenge, that sometimes after we achieve this huge, big victory, and we see this dragon lying in front of us, we say, done, I can do something else. I can enjoy my interesting life in the civil society or in private business. But there are plenty of mice and rats, and they have their motivation to stay in power and continue doing what the dragon used to do. So this is another metaphor which I would like you to live with, and I don't know whether it's an answer to your question, but I wanted to share it with you.
I have to also answer the question about the only way, because I think my answer is not yes and no. I think my answer is yes, yes, and yes. I think that I've spent a lot of time in civil society. I have a lot of friends, colleagues. Many of them are in the media, but I think that eventually we have to realize that beyond all the nice words and beyond all the rosy pictures, there are just so many vested interests in society. And finally, if you want to move something, you want to change something, you will have to wield power. Otherwise, there will be a lot of nice talk. And I can share one example about in India, in the previous government, there was a lot of rights-based legislation that was brought in. And one such rights-based legislation was the Right to Education Act. And if you read that act, it's extremely well worded, as you said, about policy making. And there was a lot of civil society participation in terms of actually drafting that act. Civil society activists, academics, they all spent a lot of time and effort in that participatory process. Except that act does not make any difference to the actual education a child gets in a public school in India. When we got into government schools, the first thing that you used to notice was when you used to enter a public school, was how much the toilets used to smell. And teachers would not come into class, they would not teach, there were abysmal learning levels. The entire political class used their power to actually get government land allocated for their private schools. One can actually document how, in which year, the Development Authority of Delhi gave land to which political leader for their chain of private schools. So that is the level of vested interest that one has to combat. Even today, for example, when we take on any private schools in terms of any malpractices that they're conducting, you find that the country's biggest lawyers appear to defend them in court. Some former ministers of the previous national government who are lawyers appear to defend them in court. That is the level of vested interest that exists, that for implementing one piece of regulation about what fees have to be charged in a private school, the former law minister of the country appears in the High Court to defend a private school. And I think that we have to realize that these vested interests are a reality and they exist at all levels. It's not easy to combat them even if you are in politics and even if you are in government, but at least you stand a chance. I think that often as civil society, we are fighting a losing battle. And we try our best, we invest a lot of our time and energy, and yet nothing changes. So I am firmly of the opinion that I don't think there is any other way. One will have to mobilize people, one will have to make citizens more involved, get them involved in the political process, and engage in politics.
Do you want to?
Yes, I agree with Atishi that to make the real change, you have to be inside of governments. But what we have to do is interact constantly with the academic sector and with the civil organizations and with the society. I have a maximum as a senator, and I always say what is obvious, but I work as a senator. And if more senators work as senators, probably we would have a different Senate. So we have these three functions: legislative, accountability, and representative functions as parliamentarians. Also, deputies have the same. So when I have to use or when I have to write some bill, I always take contact with the sector that I'm working for. For example, one of my last bill that it's now a law was a emergency for the fruit sector. They have a big crisis. So we had lots of meetings and we were working together, and then we got the solution. And I think that's the point. I belong to a political family, but I had to fight to them to be in this place because they didn't point me to be in the Senate. So if you really want to make the change, and if you really want to change the society, you have to fight for your goals.
Just one small thing in response to your question about compromise. I think that it's a very fine balance. It's a thin line that can go either way, because when we are contesting elections, one of the things that we as a party have struggled with is how do you select candidates? When we started in politics, we had a very idealistic view about how we would have primaries, how all the volunteers would vote, how a candidate would get selected. But finally, it was not about the actual process of selecting the candidate. It's also about winning the election. You can have the best candidate selection process and still lose the election. And so I think many of these decisions have to be made in that context, and I think there's never an easy solution. But in terms of the example you gave of political repentance or of the kind of policies that one is talking about, or where does one collect one's money from as a political party? Do I take any favors? I mean, do I promise favors to anyone if I'm taking donations from them? I think one has to be very clear about what is it that we want to achieve in politics. Otherwise, it's a very slippery slope.
Let's just take another really quick round. Hani, go ahead.
Yes, Hani from Egypt. I represent a civil society organization. So the three of you spoke about the civil society organization and the engagement of the civil society organization in transition. You know, Egypt now, we are working in a repressive environment. So what are your quick messages to Egyptian civil society organization to do so we can fix what is wrong in our society now? Thank you.
Okay. Any other? Okay, go ahead, please. Here, up front.
This is not a question, but I just want to share the experience from Thailand. I want to support what Lucilla said, because in Thailand we are having the so-called national reform after the military coup in 2014, and the government is doing the so-called reform, and they write the 20 years strategic plan for the country. And we are wondering, how can a reform really happen when the people, when they say they don't trust politicians anymore? And the committees who are writing the plan or the reform also mostly come from the bureaucrats. So it's like, how can you reform when all the same people are doing the same? However, I have one friend who is well graduated, educated from abroad, and he intended to come and help the country. So he decided to leave his high salary and come back to the private sector first, and then now he's in the government to change some digital industry in Thailand with the government. When he got in, now he learned that he got stuck because his boss is still the bureaucrat with the old same knowledge and attitude. So he cooperated with think tank and tried to get over to the prime minister. Otherwise, he would be tackled down before that with the people who disagree. However, now it's about the wording in the law that the Council of State is considering whether the law will be passed or not. So we can see that there are procedures that hinder, the same old procedures also hinder the reform. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Some last comments?
I'll just say that there is a very narrow path between populism on one hand and cynicism on the other hand. Populism is when you try to convince people that you have a magic stick and you can do miracles with this magic stick. Cynicism is when you believe that nothing can be changed at all. And this path is narrow and it's becoming more and more complicated these days. And I think that people from the civil society, they're really good in finding this path, this narrow path between populism and cynicism. Obviously, it's not the only way to change the world, but it's okay to go into politics. And those of you who are thinking about this will find that it's very similar to what you do in the civil society. It's also about coalition building. You are as much a politician as you are a coalition builder. And I can tell you that as someone who's been a member of parliament in opposition, I succeeded in passing over 50 pieces of legislature. It's possible, it's doable, it's manageable. And finally, I keep struggling with this challenge that Katya kindly imposed on me. And do you remember George Shultz speaking to us at Stanford 8 years ago? And I asked him, so he was a member of the Nixon administration in the 60s. And then he had a good career in the private sector and in academia. And in the 80s, he again returned to the government as a member of the Reagan administration. He was a Secretary of State. And I asked him, why did you return? You have already tried that. You know that it doesn't make you happy just be in the government. And his answer was very, very simple. He said something like, only a fool will refuse a chance to change his country for better. So I encourage all of us to think this as of an opportunity, and when this opportunity arrives, just don't throw it away just because it's politics and the government.
Any final observations?
On the question about Egypt and what should civil society organizations do, I think that not just civil society organizations, all of us, those who are in politics, those who are in the media, those who are in civil society, I think we need towards creating a more engaged citizenry. I think that all of us, many of us come from countries where people still vote based on what their caste is, what their community is. Buying and selling of votes for a few hundred, for very small amounts of money, people are willing to give their vote to certain political parties. I think until citizens are engaged on real issues, we are bound to go down the road of populism that we were talking about in the mornings. And I think that all of us have that responsibility. When we came into government, we believed that if we worked hard and we delivered, people would vote for us. And we got quite a rude shock in the municipal elections about a couple of years down the line, where despite our government have been high-performing, in the municipal elections, the people of Delhi voted for a government that had been in power for 2 terms in the municipality, and the municipality is in a total and utter disaster. Every responsibility of the municipality, waste management, managing the roads, managing some primary healthcare centers, is utter and unmitigated disaster. And people still voted for them, instead of for us who had been a high-performing government. So I think that there is a need to take all of these issues to the people and to say how voting at the time of elections affects your everyday lives. And I think that is an attempt that we all have to engage in. And I would totally agree with Andre when he said that I think that if an opportunity comes by for political engagement, I think you shouldn't refuse. I think you shouldn't refuse because despite all the problems, despite all the difficulties, the fact that one can make a difference to the lives of so many people is quite incredible.
Just very short. We need to bring people from civil society to politics. We need to have new faces, new cuadros políticos, we say in Spanish. We need to renew our politicians. We in Argentina still have these dinosaurs from so, and they just want to keep the power, you know, and so we have to push and we have to get in the politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in politics one needs people who care, who actually care about making things work and who are not just in it as a sort of investment to think that we spent so much money on our elections and we have to make so much money out of it or get ourselves ready for our next posting. I think you need people in politics who care enough to stay awake at nights to think about how various policies have to be implemented. So.
I wonder if dinosaurs are relatives to dragons.
Just one final comment. One final comment to Hani. I mean, I think the general answer, if you have a super repressive regime like the one you've got in Egypt right now, that the duty of civil society organizations is to resist, you know, and to expose their wrongdoing and, you know, to fight back and ultimately to try to change the regime. But it's an interesting question about whether you should, even under those circumstances, be willing to actually work in the government. We had a summer fellow this year who was actually working in the Egyptian government because she felt that even given how repressive it was, she could do more good on the inside than on the outside. And I don't think that that was necessarily a bad choice. If you, for example, have a democratic breakthrough and the government opens up, you're actually going to need people who have had that inside experience, but also, you know, have a more democratic attitude towards government in general. So it's a very complicated thing, I think, deciding when you've compromised too far, when it's necessary, all these sorts of things. But we're never going to answer these definitively, so join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.